been an incredible day, and now we get to have an incredible time with Darren Walker to finish it off. First of all, thank you all for coming and for participating into making this such a rich and energetic day. And also a special thank you to you, Darren Walker, for coming. This is a fantastic opportunity, so look forward to having this conversation and opening up to a Q&A. So I'll ask a few questions about a wide range of things, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A and end the day on this wonderful note. So with that, many people in the room, they know you or know of you if they've heard the name, and I thought we should just start by just sharing a little bit about your background.
Oh, great. Thank you, Damon, and thank you all for coming. I'm really honored and humbled by this opportunity to speak. And of course, Tony and Sandra, Tamer are wonderful, wonderful people I've admired for a long time. To be involved and associated with anything that they are associated with is a great privilege. So thank you for honoring me by being here and the invitation. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about me and I was born in I do think that what's relevant for this audience is that in many ways my story is the American story, in that I was certainly by all indicators born poor and to a single mother at a charity hospital in a small town in Louisiana. And I had the great honor in 1965. We lived in a little shotgun house in rural East Texas, and a lady approached the porch of our house. My mother and my sister and I were sitting on the porch, and she said that she was there to talk to my mother about a new program that was going to start in the summer of 1965, and that program was called Head Start. And the purpose of that program was to find kids like me and enroll us in what is now called pre-K, I guess, and that would hopefully give us a head start on our education. And for me, it did. I was very, very lucky to be in the first class of Head Start, and to this day, I'm enormously grateful to that program. But I also was lucky because I went to public schools in a small Texas town, and then went to a public university. And my college was in part financed by a Pell Grant. And in so many ways, I have realized that my life and the Ford Foundation have come full circle, because I did not know in 1965 that the Ford Foundation had funded the early research in New Haven on early childhood development, particularly for low-income urban and rural kids, that informed the design of the Head Start program. And so I was very lucky that the Ford Foundation was in my life then. I also didn't know that the Ford Foundation had done the early research and piloting of what was then the National Direct Student Loan Program, which became the Pell Grant. And ultimately, when I came to New York, I found myself in 1992 working at the Abyssinian Development Corporation in Harlem, and came to understand the Community Development Corporation movement. And of course, the Ford Foundation helped to create the CDC model and the intermediaries and the financing to really grow that field. So in so many ways, I've been very, very lucky. I've been lucky because for a kid like me, I always felt that my government was cheering me on and investing. I think I was lucky to be a young kid at a time when it was very clear that our government believed and invested in people like me. And I also had a community that cheered me on, and in spite of the fact that by some indicators, my life was chaotic, on other levels, I had huge support. And so in so many ways, I live every day with gratitude for being born in this country and for having the opportunity that I did to get on that mobility escalator and be given an opportunity to really realize my dreams and my aspirations.
That's great, thank you. It sets up what I was wondering about as well. So how do you explain now, you talked about not knowing how expansive and how deep the impact of the Ford Foundation has been historically, and that would include today too. And I was wondering if you could speak about what the Ford Foundation does, and how do you describe your role when someone says, so you're running Ford Foundation, what does that mean?
Well, the Ford Foundation today is evolved, I think, like all institutions that must endure and be relevant. I think today we are unabashedly, unapologetically a social justice foundation. We believe that in order to achieve the aspiration that Henry Ford charged us to strengthen American democracy and democracy around the world, that democracy will not be served and democracy will not be healthy without justice. And so therefore, today we put justice and the pursuit of a strong democracy as our bullseye, if you will. And we today have identified inequality, growing inequality, as among the greatest threats to justice and among the greatest threats to our democracy. My job is to be the CEO of this really remarkable institution that works around the world in very complicated and complex places, asking fundamental questions about who is left out, who's left behind, and from the perspective of systems and structures, because the analysis of poverty, of inequality, of injustice, if it is informed by an understanding of the systems and structures that produce and reproduce over generations advantage for some and disadvantage for others, it gives you a framework for understanding how to intervene, who to invest in and support, and the difficulty of dismantling those systems and structures have to be understood. And so today we have many, many ways in which the inequality that we see is the result of the design of systems and structures. We have a criminal justice system that is fundamentally designed to get us the outcomes that we have, which is that most people incarcerated or in our criminal justice system are Black and brown people and poor white people. It was designed to generate those outcomes. And so it's not happenstance. The system was designed. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we dismantle that system? Of course we have to have a criminal justice system, but it should be fair and it should have justice as its objective. And so as we look across society, there are patterns where the systems and structures have been designed to generate, regrettably, the same outcomes for the same people. So the people who are most impacted, disadvantaged in our criminal justice system are the same people who are most disadvantaged in our educational system, the same people who are most disadvantaged by our housing system. And so when you look across our society and you look at the accretion of inequality, it is a set of systems that have been designed to generate So it shouldn't be a surprise.
Right.
It shouldn't be a surprise. It's actually quite clear that these outcomes aren't by happenstance or serendipity.
So thank you. It's one of the things which has been fascinating about your time as leader of the Ford Foundation is sort of getting us focused around sort of what are the sort of core issues, how to think about things from a structural standpoint, and also from the perspective of Ford, how to facilitate that. And I know one of the topics today that it's been a common one is impact investing, for example. And so there was a, before then, we'll say there was the traditional investment model. We can define what that is, maybe. But and now there's been this transition to thinking more about impact investing. And I know that in addition to keeping us focused around the right topics, the other part of the role is how do you facilitate those if you're at Ford. And I was wondering if you could talk about the transition of Ford, because it's a large, storied, impactful organization, and sometimes it can be really challenging to be dynamic and to adapt, and yet that has happened. And
Much has happened. It's not happened enough in my view. But I think part of, first of all, I think impact investing is an important frontier and a very important contribution to a more fundamental issue, and that is, as a believer in capitalism, I am unapologetically a capitalist. I also, as someone who believes in it, know that it is not serving us well today, and know that if capitalism is to survive, it must produce more prosperity for more people. If the kind of capitalism that we see today continues, meaning the huge gap between those of us, and I am among the winners in this system, and those who are the losers in this system, if that calibration continues at current levels, I fear that our system will not survive. And it won't deserve to survive if we can't improve it. And so for me, the question of impact investing is part of a larger conversation that we need to have as a country, and the contribution, the very modest, very small contribution that the Ford Foundation can make is to interrogate how we deploy our capital in the marketplace, and what we do with the $13 billion that we have control and agency over. And so it's been that process that my trustees and I and the staff at Ford have been in a conversation about, that ultimately led to the foundation making a commitment of $1 billion to initiate a journey around this question of impact investing. There is, among some, a view that the work of investment advisors, and certainly a portfolio of a foundation that is charged with living into perpetuity, that return and maximizing return, profit, is the objective of the portfolio. And I actually do not believe that for a social justice foundation, I'm not speaking about other people's foundations, but for a foundation that has articulated the imperative of addressing inequality, to have an endowment portfolio that is managed to maximize profit is not defensible. And so we have to interrogate how we use our investments, and recognize that we do, as stewards of an endowment, have a fiduciary responsibility. But I do not believe that those twin objectives are irreconcilable. I believe they are reconcilable. I think we have to have intentionality, and we have to be prepared to do the work, because again, we have a system of investment management that has been constructed to get us the outcomes that we have, which in some ways reflects the larger inequality in society. So elite institutions like Columbia University's endowment and the Ford Foundation's endowment and Harvard's endowment have access to certain kinds of investment management that is able to generate alpha, that is able to add firepower to a portfolio return that others don't have access to. And so when I look at the return on, my mutual fund or whatever, and I see 2 or 3%, which is pretty good these days, and then I look at what Ford is doing, which is double digits. It's in part, it reflects that. And when I think about the president of one of the HBCUs recently with a few $100 million endowment, and his returns, which are low single digits, which is completely, I think, attractive and appropriate and consistent with where the market is. But think about the return of that important HBCU serving primarily working class African Americans, and look at the return of Columbia University's endowment, which, like most elite institutions of higher education in this country, primarily serve middle and upper income white people. That's the reality. And understanding how, if we are to be America, we have to grapple with that inequality, that we elites are benefiting enormously more. And even if we are, I gave a commencement at a wonderful elite school, and there was a meeting of as I do when I do commencements with the African American students, and needless to say, there were a few complaints about, and I just said to them, are you guys kidding me? I mean, you are the most privileged black people in this country. You are about to get a degree from an Ivy League school, and yes, you have a problem. Yes, yes, yes. But when you think about your advantage in the marketplace, as opposed to that hardworking graduate of, a small, struggling HBCU down south, you can't possibly not acknowledge, even within our own systems, our own communities, how inequality manifests. I think your question about transforming legacy institutions is a really relevant one that is, whether it's Columbia or the Riverside Church or the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation, these are institutions that, like all legacy institutions, whether it's IBM or PepsiCo, have a very hard time being agile and nimble in an environment that is requiring more agility and nimbleness. And how for legacy organizations, on the one hand, have tremendous advantage because of what we have achieved over time and because of what we know. But we also are disadvantaged because with legacy and the success of legacy comes arrogance, comes intolerance, comes a sense of, well, we've done it before, or we've heard that before, and the curiosity that you need as a kind of institutional imperative to always be open, to always interrogate your bias, your own sense of you know what's right, is really hard to do. Yeah. And so, for me at Ford, it's been, in part, you make sure the people who are the legacy staff are rewarded for that kind of behavior, and the ones who aren't have to go. Yeah. And then you find talent to ensure that you have a fluidity and a porousness in among your staff. And then finally, it's about the board and the trustees. I am very, very lucky because over my tenure, we've elected 9 trustees out of 14. And the board has itself transitioned to another era under new leadership, and we're very much in sync. And so that helps a lot, because foundations, by their very nature, are privileged institutions. And privileged institutions and privileged people do not like change. In fact, privilege is supposed to buy you insularity from change, right? So the idea of privilege at its core is about buying yourself some insulation from the kinds of things that most people worry about, right? So I've lived a life without privilege, and I've lived a life with privilege. And living with privilege is pretty amazing. And I say that because I know what it's like not to live with privilege. Right. Do you know, I mean, when I was in college, I was like most kids in college. Fortunately, I was on scholarship, so I didn't worry about, right. But I always, you mind your money, and I was, my checking account was at the student credit union, and when I came to New York to the law firm my first summer, the lady who took care of the new associates gave me this packet, and she said, oh, take this and go to 55 Wall Street to Citi. Well, it wasn't even Citibank. This is how old I am. Whatever it was called, before it was Cipriani, whatever it was called in those days. And I go there, and I'm with my little envelope, and I see the line, and I go, and I'm standing in the line, and this nice lady with her Citibank badge is walking through the line, and she's helping people, and I said, oh, I'm here to open a new account, and I gave her my packet, and she said, oh, sir, you're in the wrong line. And so she takes me, and she says, please come with me. And so she takes me up these stairs to this sign, and it said private bank. I did not know that there was a private bank. I thought a bank was a bank. And all of a sudden, she takes me into this room with beautiful sort of magenta red carpet and a chandelier, and there was a nice lady behind a mahogany desk, and she says, sir, may I help you? And she I sit down, and she proceeds to tell me that, as an associate at the law firm, I was going to be in the private bank, and they would take care of me, and that, all sorts of things that, you can bounce checks and we'll pay them. It was just, she just said all sorts of things that, I growing up with my poor mother every week, sweating out whether she had enough money, and I came to understand, well, my goodness, if you're in a private bank, you have all these benefits that the people who are down in that line downstairs, that long line in the middle of that hot summer, those people don't have those benefits. Nobody lets them bounce checks without charging them. No one sends them rebates on their credit card. Just all sorts of things that, and so it's a metaphor for the way in which our society is, that for some of us, we have these benefits. And so for a foundation like Ford, we have benefits, we have privileges. We should be taking more risk. We should be bolder. We should be more courageous. And it's really, well, but we're not. We're not enough. This is my point. My point is, don't clap, because my frustration is institutions today that have privilege, that have the resources, are still too timid, are still too concerned about preservation and conservation. And so when I talk to my trustees, I say, I don't want to call, someone said, well, we're stewards. And I said, we're not stewards. Stewards are people who clip coupons and who are interested in preserving their, we have to be change makers. We can be responsible. We're not gonna, I don't wanna, blow up the endowment, but we should be taking more risk. And it's, it's hard sometimes because all of the systems around us are designed to discourage courage. I was talking to a president of a major university who came to see me and said, oh, I read your speech on, and it was really great. And I said, well, there was a time when university presidents made speeches like that. It's not like it was some, and they said, I could never make a speech like that. And you called out all kinds of people and all kinds of problems in our society. I would offend some of my donors. There's no way I could make a speech like that. And I thought to myself, what a shame. Yeah. You're a president. Democratic institutions are essential to a thriving democracy, and democratic institutions like universities and their leaders need to call out injustice, need to hold us accountable. And when you can't do that because you are worried that you are going to offend rich people, then democracy has a problem. And so, or you're going to offend the Ford Foundation. We've got a problem then. And so what I want to do and what I don't do enough of and I want Ford to get better at is saying, how can we be courageous? How can we be more bold? How can we call out injustice? And how can we look at our own behavior, which can contribute to that, and interrogate our own hypocrisies, and be honest about that.
You have another career as a spoken word, by the way, because a few times there I was about to snap off. But I'm going to try to focus on my job here. So I want to get a chance for folks to ask questions. Here too. I'm going to ask one question to sort of help us maybe transition to that. And so about half of the people in the room are students, and many of them will be graduating fairly soon. And I was wondering if you had any advice for someone, given sort of why we're here today and the sort of things we're thinking about, would you have any advice for someone who's about to enter the world of post-graduation?
Well, it's really interesting because on some levels, what we have done to young people today is an injustice, because I don't believe that you should have a plan. A plan in the way in which I experience young people today, having mapped out things, and having clearly articulated pathways that they see to reach some aspiration. I love the idea of ambition. I was very ambitious. I've always been ambitious. But I also never felt that I had a path that was taking me to a job, or to, I always, in fairness, I was very clear that I had a path to Wall Street. There was no doubt, and one of the things about growing up poor is that you are ambitious not to be poor, right? So I would be disingenuous and insincere if I were to say I wasn't, focused on right? So I was focused, because I knew I would have to take care of my mother. I knew that my sisters were going to college. So I was very clear that I was not going to be like my roommate who said, oh, I'm going to go and make $18,000 a year working for the ACLU. And my other friend who said, I'm going to go and work in a public interest law firm. And, well, good for you that your parents can pay your rent or you've got a trust fund. go girl. I was not in that, right? And so
Yeah.
for me, I knew that I had to do that. So just want to be clear, I was very driven in that way. But I also knew that that was not the path for me, right? That the idea, and it really became clear after working a decade on Wall Street, and where you really have to want to make a lot of money, right? So to me, if you got a bonus of a few $100,000, I mean that was like more money than well, the guys I work with, that was like that's just not doing it. I mean, you're not hungry enough, right? And I remember literally in my annual review one year, my boss saying to me, Darren, you are not hungry enough. You are not hungry enough. You should be making more money. Now, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm making more money than my mother in 1 year than my mother made in her entire life. And so, but I wasn't hungry enough, right? And so I do think that the path of your ambition takes you in different places. And for some people, it is to the private sector. I'm a huge believer in the value of working in the private sector for some period of your career. I learned working at a law firm was a great way for me to understand the complexities of all kinds of things. And I was very lucky because I worked for some really hard working partners. So that was a great experience. But ultimately, my passion, what I wanted to do, was not be in an environment where everything was about my P&L and where I could come to work every day and see the rewards, the benefits to other people who look like me. I mean, when the first deal that I worked on was a deal that was a great, innovative, asset-backed transaction that was really unusual in 1985. It basically made wealthy people wealthier. But what was so rewarding to me was to take those same skills, understanding of project finance, understanding real estate, and to use those skills to develop low-income housing, or to develop a supermarket on 125th Street, or to put together the construction budget for a new school that had never been built before, a school like it had never been built before in Harlem. I mean, it was the private sector experience that gave me such an advantage, because what I found was that there weren't a lot of people with my background coming into community development at that time. There is now, but in the 90s, there wasn't. And so I just think my advice for people is to be ambitious. But that does not mean that you have to have mapped out, I am going to first go to McKinsey, and I'm going to be there for 2 years, and then I'm going to go to Columbia Business School, and then I'm going to go, hopefully, to Morgan Stanley, and then I'm going to, I talk to young people today, and that's the way, people talk to me. Yeah. And I just think, my gosh, you should just say, I'm interested in changing the world, and I think here are some ways in which I can do it. And of course you have to be focused, but be open to serendipity. I have never had a plan for my career. I literally, every opportunity that has come my way, it is because of serendipity. And some divine intervention, of course, I believe. But it is, and so what I found is, if you really work hard on the journey, it redounds to your benefit in ways in which you never know. Because when I was at the Abyssinian Development Corporation, which was one of the highlights of my life and my work, I've never enjoyed work more than when you're actually working on the ground every day with these amazing colleagues, doing work that affects people and you can see it. But when I got a call from someone saying, oh, I gave your name to the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, I didn't I didn't want a career in philanthropy. I still don't want a career in philanthropy. And so it wasn't like I wanted a career in philanthropy. But this person observed me. This was the head of another foundation who was funded Abyssinian. And, she gave my name to the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. I would have never thought that anyone would, well, she did. And then I find myself sitting in his office, and, this interview, which is super intense for several weeks, goes through. Well, after I'm hired, at some point, my vice president says, well, what was the really great thing that happened was, and she mentioned the name of of the foundation's lawyer. And she said, well, her husband, you did a project for him at Cleary Gottlieb when you were an associate. And she just raved about you during the interview process, And I thought, I did one project for her husband. I did one memo when I was a summer associate for her husband. But the fact that he would say something to her that she would then bring to the interview committee when I was being vetted was complete serendipity. You can't plan these things, right? And so my whole journey, when I was at Rockefeller, I get this email pop up. Hi, I'm the new president of the Ford Foundation, and your name keeps coming up. Let's have lunch. And, so I go. I don't know this person, who's the new president of the Ford Foundation. And he says, and by the end of lunch, he's like, how do I get you to come to work at Ford? And I was like, I'm not coming to work at Ford. I'm very happy at Rockefeller, And so he's like, well, don't worry. I'm going to keep trying. And so we did for 3 years. And finally, 3 years in, I went to Ford. It was complete serendipity. I had never, if you'd said to me when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation that I was going to be president of the Ford Foundation, I would have laughed in your face. I would have just thought there was absolutely Ford to be about the last place I'd end up. My true ambition, and just to, put everything out, was to be president of Rockefeller. I thought, so to be clear, I'm ambitious. I've always been ambitious. And in fact, someone said to me, one of the trustees said to me when I was thinking about leaving, and my boss, Judith Roden, who was my boss, had told the trustees, and she had them lined up to come and convince me not to leave Rockefeller. And so one of the trustees came in and said, Judy's told me to come and talk to you and convince you not to leave, but you should leave. And he said, you should leave because when Judy retires, you'll be more attractive to us if you are at Ford. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. But again, it was such a, and so it's not to say that we're not ambitious, that we don't have but then you go to Ford and, the president leaves Ford. Well, and these things just happen. And again, it's not like, I'm Pollyannish, these things just happen. Einstein said, luck favors the prepared mind. So you work hard, you do all you can, and there will be luck. There will be breaks. There will be serendipity. There will be people who you don't even know behind the curtain who are pulling the strings or advocating for you because on the journey, what they've observed is how hard you work, the quality of your product. All of those things is what is observed that then is able to advance you in terms of your career and professional development.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions.
Oh my goodness, they have to come all the way here and I would be intimidated if
I would catch a cramp if I was.
I know, right? Me too, Damon. I wouldn't have the confidence to walk up like Melissa Berman is doing. Hello, Professor Berman.
Thank you, Darren. So we've been sort of embarked on a conversation about very serious issues in the world: poverty, inequity, systemic injustice, the role of the capital market system. And in the context of climate change and in the context of things of this scope and scale, often when we think about something like the arts seem to be an exemplar of pure privilege and something that's trivial. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the role of the arts in making change against the very, very deep, complex problems that we've been talking about?
Well, I believe that the arts are the foundation of our civilization and our culture, because through the arts, we define who we are as a people. And artists are essential to any civilization because artists are courageous and artists hold the mirror up to society. And for me, you know, this notion that, well, you know, food and shelter and these, you know, Pavlov, I mean, of course, yes, the hierarchy. But when I was a little boy, my grandmother, who was a maid for a family, a wealthy family, and she would get their discarded things, and she would bring them to me and my sister, and you know, over time she saw what I liked, and she would bring me more. What I really loved were the arts books. I loved the discarded programs from the Alley Theater in Houston, or the Houston Ballet, or I remember all of these things that I would see as a little boy, and they would take me away from where I was. And the ability to have imagination and to have fantasy and to dream as a child, particularly for poor kids and kids who don't have the opportunity to be exposed, to travel. It was just a huge privilege for me, and it opened up for me all of my ability to imagine a world outside of my own. And so I don't buy the ideology of you know, well, if you're poor, what you really are focused on and what you really need is food. Of course you need food. Of course you need shelter. But you also need beauty, and you deserve to have beauty, and you deserve to observe and see beauty. And I see that when I travel to Mumbai and go to the slums in Dharavi, and you see the arts, you see in places that most of us would think of as slums and as places of enormous deprivation, you see beauty, and you understand that the arts are about helping people see beauty in their own lives and giving people dignity. And the notion of dignity is fundamental to justice. And the idea of justice, the objective of justice, can't be achieved without empathy. And empathy can't be achieved without the arts. And so if we want to have a more just society, we must be a more empathetic people. And we can see today what happens when people don't have empathy. They are crueler. People without empathy are cruel. And it is hard for people with empathy to understand their random meanness and lack of humanity and lack of extending humanity to other people, and particularly other people who don't look like them. And so for me, the arts are critical. They're critical to strengthening our democracy. I could talk a long time, so I will shut up because then we'll get into it. Sorry.
Hello. Hi. My name's Ruby, and I just want to say, as a student, as someone with an arts background who's now pursuing, I don't know, I'm pursuing business, and I want to impact the world. You are inspiring.
Oh, thank
and what you just said, I'm so happy that you asked that question, because that was a great question. So, like you, I am not from New York, but I'm here. And I have family from Texas, from Louisiana. I have a very similar background. However, I'm in a new community and I want to understand and be empathetic towards this new community, and I'd like your advice for myself, for all of us in the room. What is your advice towards coming into new communities and understanding them? Maybe you can talk about Ford's new decision to move to Detroit, or to have an office in Detroit. And then to follow, I have my notes here. To follow up on that, how can we better invest capital in genuine and non-demeaning ways into new communities? So maybe elaborate on your work in Harlem and how you did that in a way where you're not from Harlem, but you're making major impact that people are taking advantage of.
Thank you for that great question. So I think part of what I believe will make a difference is if, I think one of the real challenges of development over the years, when I look over Ford's record and the record of other development organizations around the world, is that we believed that the answers, the solutions to the challenges we saw in the world, poverty, for example, let's just start there, were to be designed by experts and technocrats at the World Bank and the Ford Foundation. And that what we needed to do was to just get the smartest people in a conference room and design really great programs for all of those Africans and Indians and others who just needed to be saved by us. And I think, you know, the villages of African countries and communities are riddled with rusting equipment and projects that were ineffective. And they were ineffective because we did not consider the perspectives and views of the very people we were seeking to help. And so I believe that we will be more effective if we are better listeners, if we are more humble, if we do not privilege credentialed knowledge over the authentic lived experience of the people who are closest to the challenge. Because the key to unlocking the solutions lie in them and their communities. And it doesn't mean that we're not needed. Of course we're needed. But we need to understand how we best can help unlock the solutions with them, right? And so whether you are working in Harlem and you're new to Harlem, as I was when I moved to Harlem in the early 90s, or you're working in Detroit, where I just was, and where there's, you know, amazing work happening and real tension between incumbent Detroiters, primarily black folks, and all of these wonderful, enthusiastic, young Brooklynites who are moving to Detroit, right? I mean, and when you go to Detroit now, when I think about my first visit to Detroit, I mean, you can't even believe. You cannot believe that this, at least the main downtown and the main section of the city looks, I mean, you can't believe it. When you go out to the neighborhoods, huge problems. But the incumbent residents there can't be made to feel like everything now has to be redesigned to accommodate all of these wonderful yuppies from Brooklyn who are moving to Detroit, right? And it's the same thing wherever you are in the world. And so humility, listening, not privileging, being proximate, I think and validating what is there, right? One of the things that we sometimes do is go into a place and we don't validate the people who are there, the culture that is there. We think that we need something to be brought in to supplant what is there, when in fact what is there is part of the reason you want to, you know, Harlem has changed a lot from when I worked in Harlem. And my partner, who is, you know, a white guy from Chappaqua, who is probably, you know, we went to Harlem to an event, you know, a few weeks ago, and you know, I said, oh, come uptown, we're going to Harlem, there's, you know, this new restaurant's open, whatever. And so, and again, now he's like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy from Chappaqua, and we walk in and he says to me, what are all these white people doing here? He says, like, I thought you were bringing me to Harlem. Like, I don't want to, we could have stayed down in Chelsea for this. And what he was articulating is, like, don't let Harlem lose what Harlem has that makes Harlem so interesting. And if, we could have just stayed down in Chelsea. If restaurants in Harlem are going to be just like restaurants in Chelsea. And so that's the point of preserving the authenticity, because that authenticity is an asset. Look who's here.
You're a wonderful leader, Mr. Walker. And I hope that the serendipity that you talked in your life would take us to you being a president of this country, or at least a senator.
He knows me. He knows me. This was my banker. There were nice bankers when I was at the Abyssinian Development Corporation.
So my question to you, Darren, is you said that we need to take more risk, and not yet. But as an iconoclast and a leader, what are you doing to get there?
Well, one of the things, the meeting I was in before was a meeting of a network of foundation presidents that I helped organize a few years ago. And part of the effort of this network was to bring together a group of us who agree that we need to do more and that we need to be bolder and to support each other in doing that. Because we all acknowledge that it's not easy, and that, a lot of times, as I said, our systems and structures, like, it's budget time. Okay, what are we gonna do with our 5% this year? Well, during times like this, is talking about 5% really the conversation? Really? Like, Rome is burning, and we're like talking about basis points in terms of what we're gonna pay out next year. And so to give each other support to say, you know what, here's how I got my board to give me another $150 million in the budget next year, in addition to what we would normally, and to do this and this, or here's how I'm working to get my CIO to work with me on making, endowment investments in impact investing. So part of what we do, what I can do and should do, is to incent behind the scenes, quietly, with fellow travelers who also want the kind of change that all of us want. And in an institutional paradigm where change like that is really hard to affect. And then you have to be outside, and you have to say things that sometimes get you in trouble, that have people write your board chair and tell them that you should be fired, that have people to do all sorts of things that can get you in trouble, or that can and feel that you really have to do that. So there's both sort of an inside game and then there's an outside game, and that's what I have to do.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. It's always great to have a conference and to end it on the same energy that it begins on, and really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's a huge honor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.